What he volunteered to do was go in and be that person for the hospital at no charge to the hospital for a year till they got their budget right. He looked after the telescopes, washed the telescopes, put the telescopes, handed them to the people to be sterile, and in that entire year, they didn't break a single telescope.
Beyond Clean offers a creative look into the inner workings of a healthcare industry committed to getting it right. Every instrument, every time. Join us every week as we explore the hidden world of one of the most important aspects of safe surgical care. And now your hosts, Hank Balch and Justin Poulin.
This week on Beyond Clean, we speak with Rick Wells, president at SolutionWells, LLC, a consulting company that engages with hospitals and businesses to identify and reduce unnecessary costs. Rick is an experienced president with a demonstrated history of working in the medical device industry for 31 years. And Hank, I know he's going to tell us a little bit about his experience, but I think primarily something that you and I wanted to reach out to him about was the process of developing customized trays. And then also he's done some studies, and everybody knows sterile processing needs more studies to justify expenses related to proper practices or best practices to control costs in a healthcare environment that, as we'll talk about later, I'm sure, has kind of already attacked all the low-hanging fruit.
That's right, Justin. Just like with many of our other episodes, I'm looking forward to this show in particular because it will give tools to sterile processing leaders, OR leaders, and physicians who see repair issues and even loss issues, but don't really know how to address them in a process-oriented way. I think this idea of customized trays could be one of those great tools in the tool chest to make a solution stick.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And so we're going to be back in a minute with Rick Wells, but a reminder, you can follow Beyond Clean on Twitter at Beyond Clean Info. The Facebook page is facebook.com/Beyond Clean Podcast. LinkedIn is linkedin.com/company/Beyond Clean. And the website with all of our shows, just go to beyondclean.net and you can send an email if you'd like us to answer a question on the show, or if you have feedback about future topics or future guests that you'd like to hear us interview. Send us an email to info@beyondclean.net. And we'll be right back with Rick Wells, president at SolutionWells, LLC. Joining us now is Rick Wells, president at SolutionWells. And Rick, I'm interested in talking to you today, especially because my background is also in instrument repair, and I know a lot of the topics that we're going to discuss are right along those lines. I'm interested to not only hear what you have to say, but learn a little bit more about how you're trying to quantify some ways to make investments to reduce damages. And I can tell you, metrics and analytics is something that Hank and I have touted on this show several times as a major need in the industry. So can't wait to get to that. But first, I think we should just set the table and hear a little bit about your industry background. So maybe introduce yourselves to the listeners of the show.
Yeah, my name's Rick Wells. I've been in the industry over 30 years. I started out back in the early 80s with Ethicon Endosurgery. Was with them for 10 years, and then I went with Boston Scientific, and I was with Boston Scientific for 5, and then I made a move and went back into the operating room, and I was with Carl Storz for 15. And the last 5 to 6 years that I was with them, I was over the repair for the southern area of the country, and I would basically come into hospitals to negotiate pricing and or do assessments trying to figure out why things were getting damaged. And that's basically when I left them to go and start my own company, was after some of the things we're going to talk about today. And I just felt that it was really needed in the marketplace. So that's kind of my career in the medical industry. I love surgery. I love SPD. And I think one of the things was the biggest eye-opening experience for me was when I got my ISHM certification as a vendor. Those 32 hours were brutal, very, very difficult. So it increased my respect for the people that work in that department.
Well, I'll tell you what, I also have the CCSVP, and I think it was maybe 3 shows ago, Hank, we were talking about the importance of getting the CCSVP because certification's typically been pushed mostly on the provider side, but not necessarily as hard on the vendor side. And the company I originally jumped from healthcare provider over to vendor, they required that all their sales reps get that CCSVP. And I think, it was also, I would say, strenuous, but eye-opening. Having worked on the provider side but not in sterile processing, it was really key for me to build my knowledge. I'm sure you'd feel the same way. And I also wondered, did you get connected with somebody that kind of mentored you as a result of that? When you have to go do those 32 hours, it's certainly better than showing up and winding up just shadowing or standing behind somebody. It's a lot better if you can really get engaged and somebody who's a supervisor or a manager takes you under their wing and really teaches you.
Absolutely. A local hospital here in North Carolina, I was a regional manager with Carl Stortz, and I knew her. And so when I approached her to do this, so she basically kind of walked me through everything, and we did everything. And then I had another hospital down in Florida that I was working with that I'd become close with the SPD supervisor. So those were the 2 people that I worked with, one that was here local and then one that was down in Florida. And the SPD managers were very involved in what I was doing. And actually, the gal here allowed me to do a lot more than what I was supposed to do. So, because I really wanted to be hands-on, and I wanted to really understand what people face day in and day out, so that, the consulting thing had been rolling around in my head for probably 2 years, and I really wanted to understand that better. And so it was a great segue for what I'm doing now.
So, Rick, you talked a little bit about your background in terms of the repair question and the repair side of the equation, but how in particular, or I guess maybe why, out of everything that you could have focused on with your consulting business, did you focus so much on this tray customization question?
So back there was a Senate subcommittee about cross-contamination, and I don't remember what year it was, but I think it was like 2008, 2009. There was somebody in Austin, Texas, got an infection from a shoulder set or something like that, and so all these Senate subcommittee hearings happened. And in the process of all that, there was testimony about how if we can eliminate human error, we can get things cleaner. And so at that point, the company I was working for, we bought a basket tray for our telescopes, because one of the things that, drives the minimally invasive business is the ability to see and see well. And we bought a basket, which is a custom tray that carries telescopes. That what was unique about it is it was approved to go through the washer with the telescope in it, so telescopes didn't have to be hand washed at the sink. And it wasn't successful at first, and then we decided to do some studies. And the numbers that came back they were unbelievable, actually. And I thought that can't be true. So I ran a couple more studies myself at a couple other hospitals that I was in. And the numbers came back almost dead on the numbers. And I said, man, if we're getting results like 60 to 68% reduction of breakage on rigid telescopes, why wouldn't anybody do that? So that began the journey of me looking into custom trays. And so how I got to where I am now is I began looking for companies that actually manufactured trays so that when I go into hospitals, I could recommend them, because the one that I had, gotten familiar with was plastic, and they break sometimes. And so I was looking for somebody that could do it in aluminum or stainless steel or anything, just to create some longevity. So that's how I got into it. Was when I saw the results of what a custom tray could do for a hospital, I said, I need to go evangelize this, and so that's why I started my company.
No, that's great. So the perspective then in the industry when you go into these facilities when you're talking to the OR leaders or for the CS leaders, how well known is that option even to put your items, your heavy repair items, maybe in custom trays?
The minute you use the word custom, people think expensive. So that's a hurdle that has to be overcome. And so then there's really no studies helping people work through it. You know, it's all this anecdotal stuff. And as you know, when you approach the CFO in a hospital, anecdotes don't work. Soft costs don't work. I want to see hard costs. So I began talking to different companies saying, you know, let's do some studies on these custom trays to see if they actually, in fact, do deliver the results that we think they deliver. And it has gone from the basket trays for telescopes, and it started migrating into very delicate instruments that are expensive and just things that are expensive to try to, as I like to put it, eliminate as many touches as possible. The more it's handled, the more chances it is to get damaged. So if we can keep it in a custom tray and do different things, you know, and we'll get into that a little bit more, but can I run it through the washer without having to hand wash it? If I take off the gross debris, that's considered cleaning, and then it goes through an automatic washer. It's all in the IFUs for the rigid telescopes. Every single one of the manufacturers have it in there. So that made me start wondering, you know, hey, would this work for other things too? Do we see that kind of impact? And so that's kind of where this thing is gone. And I'm pleasantly surprised.
Yeah, I want to dive into the root causes of that, because you mentioned anecdotal evidence, and I would even say sometimes intuitive. You know, you and I probably see all the time in that repair industry where the preventable damages are. But to your point, if the solution costs more money, it's not a value-added service from maybe the repair vendor or, you know, other educational sources. If it's not a value add, then it means I got to cut a check. So it can't always be anecdotal. I know you said custom sort of equates to expensive, and that's not always the case, and we'll get into that. But let's talk about some of the root causes of those damages, especially as it relates to hand washing. What did you discover, or what did you inherently know was causing those damages that you felt like the custom trays, you know, you obviously had a hypothesis, right? So what led you to that hypothesis?
Well, I think, you know, there's the ongoing battle between the OR and SPD. OR blames SPD for breaking everything, and the SPD blames the OR. And so, you know, common sense says that 50% would happen in the OR and 50% would happen in SPD. And when we put these trays out there were 4 studies done, and we had results from 40 to 68. Actually, we had one that was 75% reduction. And so what we determined was if I'm eliminating all of the hand washing, and the people in SPD do not have to look through the telescopes to say, yes, this is a good scope, because we basically told the OR, look, you've got the video equipment. It magnifies any imperfections 20-fold. So if you send us a telescope, we're going to consider it good. And if it's a bad telescope, it needs to go out up in the OR. So anything coming down to SPD is considered good. So the telescopes come down in the basket trays. They're supposed to get wiped off of gross debris in the OR. They come down, they go through the automatic washer, they come out the other side, they get wrapped sterile, so they're never touched again. So when you start thinking about that, if I can reduce damage 60% by not washing them at the sink, what does that mean? And so after playing around with it, and in the study that I'm doing right now, we think that about 10% is happening on the way down from the OR, and the other 10% happens on the way back up. So 40% is actually happening in SPD, and 40% happens in surgery. And you've got the transportation issue on both sides. So that's what we've learned on the studies from the past and what I just recently did. Now, can I give you exact numbers? 10 telescopes were broken in the elevator? No, but I know that 4 of them were, you know, and that's as far as I can go in that. But so sometimes it's not being put back into their trays that causes the problem.
Yeah, that's where the education piece. It's multiple attack points, but to your point, if you don't have the tray, no amount of education is going to fix the fact that the rigid scope isn't secured during transport. We have to have a tray first.
It's the old, the definition of insanity. We're going to continue to do the same thing over and over again, but we're going to expect a different result. And that's where this is. I mean, I had a guy in Oklahoma City tell me that, I asked him about his repair budget, and he said, we're basically still doing what we did last year. And I'm like, just because you had 100,000 last year and you're on track for that this year, that's not good. Something's wrong. You need to fix it. The repair business in the United States, according to Detroit News, is a $50 billion year business in the United States. And that means 2.5 million a year is broken every single day in hospitals. Now, that's beds to wheelchairs to surgical instruments. That's the whole kit and caboodle. But I know for a fact that minimally invasive surgical instruments, it's $2.2 billion just in minimally invasive stuff every year. So it's broken, and we need to change the thinking around that. And that's what prompted the article in Communique about business as usual. So I kind of got off topic there, so forgive me.
No, but that's absolutely a great point, Rick. That business as usual, or we should always be striving for improvements, and even to take your, I guess, study another step further at some point, once you have a baseline, would be awesome to see how often or how much the damages were caused during surgery from a surgeon torquing on the scope. And I think that's probably a whole nother layer of study. That's not something that you can show before and after from an intervention like the surgical tray, but it would be interesting to see, how many of those repairs, and typically some of that torquing, unless it's really bad, is a little bit more, I think ordinarily people would deem it as normal wear and tear because the breakage is a little bit slower over time, typically. Not always, but typically. Would you agree with that?
Yeah. Well, it's really interesting. Usually you can tell when a surgeon has broke a scope because, at the level on the telescope, you'll have a broken rod lens. Typically there'll be a indentation in a circular indentation on the telescope, because what happens where it goes to the trocar, they're pushing and turning on it the entire time, and it'll dent. And so usually, not all the time, but you can sometimes tell that. And that's just one in a million things that you can look at to try to figure out. And you don't always know, but everybody blames it on residents and they blame it on surgeons. And a case in point, a lot of times these OEMs, they'll put on-site endoscopic reps that actually work in the hospitals. And I know a person that had one of these that was supposed to go in, and because of budget, it didn't happen. And so what he volunteered to do was go in and be that person for the hospital at no charge to the hospital for a year till they got their budget right. He looked after the telescopes, washed the telescopes, put the telescopes, handed them to the people to be sterile, and in that entire year, they didn't break a single telescope. So the surgeons and the people in the OR were still using them, but because he was taking them out of the room after the case, remember it's 10% down to SPD, then you've got what happens down there, and then you have when it goes back up. So he had a whole year where he didn't break a single 5mm telescope. And that's remarkable. And then he goes on mission trips to Honduras, and in 11 years, he's had one laparoscopic instrument broken, and he's had one telescope in 11 years, and he does it every summer. But he handles all of the instruments to and from surgery. So transportation, and that's both ways, is really a critical component. And if we can eliminate non-critical touches, it really, I think hospitals can cut anywhere from 40 to 60% of their repairs. Not in everything, but in a lot of things that are getting damaged. I think a lot of these, the dollars that are running out the back door could be saved and used buying capital equipment or whatever, a new bed or a new C-arm or whatever.
paying for the guy to take care of him. I mean, he basically paid for himself in that year. I'm sure whatever the reduced budget was would have covered his salary. That's very interesting. It'd be interesting to see if they could replicate that. Rick, that's really good information, and we're going to be right back for segment 2 after a quick break. We are back with Rick Wells, president at SolutionWells. And Rick, we want to talk to you about this study that appeared in May in Healthcare Purchasing News regarding Altru Hospital and some of your findings. And I know we alluded to it in the first segment, but let's take that deeper dive. Start off and talk about the background or lead into the study, how you did the study and why you decided to do it.
Well, the hospital was building a new eye center, and they have an eye center that's off-site right now, but it had its own SPD. And the new eye center was going to be across town, and so they were going to the hospital will be processing on the main site, but every day all of those sets would be going back and forth to the other site, and so they were worried about their damage increasing because of transportation in a truck. So they said, we would like to look at custom trays and see if that can help us. And so essentially that's how this whole thing began. And I went up and basically gathered all the data, talked to all the different departments. I talked with the people with the washers, the ultrasonics, and making sure that all this stuff was getting dialed in correctly to make sure the IFUs were followed. I went through every single instrument in the trays and looked up all the IFU information to make sure that that was correct at the facility. And that's probably one of the most important things that can be done. Sometimes the IFUs are a little incongruous with one another, but, I tried to do the best that we could for that and get everything dialed in. And that's essentially, they were trying to not have their damage escalate when they were doing the off-site eye center.
It's interesting because there's been a big movement, and I know a lot of this model exists in Europe, but there's been increasing movement in the United States to move to off-site reprocessing centers. And with so much focus, as you're describing, with transportation being where much of the damages occur. And I understand that it's not necessarily just transportation, literally, like for this study in a vehicle, but just moving from one point to another. I'm thinking for the success of that model that having these types of customized trays would almost be essential.
Yeah, it's really important because the tray that they were using before, they were just all of these delicate eye instruments were laying on a finger mat. And, they had A, B, and C areas. And it was really interesting to watch some of this. But, when they would put the tray into the ultrasonic in the old system, these things, they were all over the place. And stuff would be in the ultrasonic. In the days that I was actually doing my walkthrough and following stuff through the ORs, the red flags started going up saying, boy, not only do these trays need to have stuff buttoned down, but they need to have a top to hold it in there so that when stuff does go through the ultrasonic, it's not vibrating it, with the cavitation out of place. And again, transportation, like I mentioned earlier, is, the movement from one department to the next, and then storage. And then in Altru's situation, they will be moving it from the main hospital out to the eye center when they're doing their eyes, and then back to be decontaminated and processed and sterilized again. So it's really important. If you've got instruments that are expensive, you do not want them being damaged.
So, Rick, when you talk about the finger mat, or obviously like we all have the picture in our mind of the normal metal basket, but when we talk about custom trays, we may could use a little more specific definition. So as we delve into this study, then what did these customized trays entail specifically?
Basically what I did is the company that was supplying the trays, I had the rep come in and sit down with the customers, and they explain their setup and that they have two doctors, and two of them use certain instruments, and they always use all the time. And then there were other instruments in the tray that only one doctor uses, and then the other side. And so we all sat down at the table and we collaborated on what was the best way to do this so that we could give them something that their staff was familiar with. It was easy for the staff to put things back in the proper place, and without having too much of an in-service. We wanted to make it as seamless as possible. So it was just a collaboration between the tray manufacturer and the customer. And I was involved because obviously I was running the study. So, and I just brought them together. And that's basically what it is. You're just basically putting together something that takes into account storage, transportation, sterilization, going through the washers and ultrasonics, and it's going to be held in place through all of that. And if somebody's carrying it improperly, or if it gets dropped, or any of the things that you don't want to happen, what if it does happen? Is it safe? And in the tray that they had, there was a good 1.5 inches of free space for those instruments. If it was dropped, even 6 inches, that stuff would bounce around and be all mixed up. That's what customization means. Just sitting down and making sure that every instrument has a home and it's held in place.
So we're talking about things like the rubber holders, the dividers for multiple little pieces of instruments, maybe little boxes that are screwed to the bottom of the container to hold screws in place so they're not rattling around. So it really is a host of different tools in this container to hold in place the whole spectrum of different types of instrumentation.
Yeah, and the beauty of this is, we did a study on the cataract instrument. We also went through and looked at their laparoscopic instruments. And one of the beautiful things about when you go through this process of collaboration and working with the customer, all of a sudden they began to say, you know what, we don't use those instruments anymore. So there's like 10 or 15 things in here that we don't need anymore. And so what happens is all of that stuff goes out of the tray, and that shortens the time to clean it at the end of the day. It's easier to find in the OR, and there's fewer instruments to care for. It kind of culls the herd, so to speak. So there's a lot of things going through this exercise, that are kind of a soft cost that you really can't talk about to a CFO. But for the people working in SPD, if you're having to clean 10 instrument versus 25 every time that tray comes, that's some significant time. So
that's a great point. In our interview with Brian Reed from Asenco, we talked a little bit about the data points that are out there for reducing instrument flow, I think was the phrase that he used. But I like that you brought that up again, because when you talked about sitting down with these two doctors, the sterile processing leader in me just started jumping up in the air saying, yes, great, we got the users at the table and they're making decisions. And as you said, it's not just customization decisions. And I think if you want to talk about a magical word to get surgeons to come make decisions, tell them, hey, doc, we would like to customize your tray. That will get some folks to the table. And then, as you said, it gives you, as the sterile processing leader in the facility, a great excuse and opportunity to say, do you really use this forceps? And if so, how many times can we take it out and pill pack it for backup? And then every other time that tray is being transported, all those 10% and 40%, that one forceps is not even a part of that. It's camping out until it's really needed. And again, you're seeing those reductions. So that's a great point. And it's good to hear how that collaboration starts with the physician. So I'd like to talk a little bit more in terms of the study on how you drove the collaboration through the life of the study, because you're tracking this, if you will, real time. So you get the setup in place, you get the doctors to make the decisions, the trays are customized, then what happens?
All throughout, we did in-services for the staff in the OR. Numerous times we did in-services down in SPD. We talked to the doctors. In that time frame of about 3 months, I was up there quite often, so I began developing relationships with certain people, and basically worked with the department heads of the SPD and the OR saying, we're going to follow this for a year. I'd like to be able to call up here and talk to people to get the data points and find out, if things are being damaged. Can I get the invoices so that I can look at it? And can you write the companies that are doing the repair so that they will, because I tried calling them initially, and whenever a company hears that a consultant is involved, man, the brakes go on, and they think they're going to lose the business. So I had the customer call, and we started getting data to make sure that it's all correct. Because sometimes people lose invoices inside the hospital, things disappear, but the companies are billing them. So, and occasionally that gets screwed up too. But for the most part, it was just a matter of just making sure that I had redundancy so that I was getting good information and creating relationships with the people that information went through. And so I follow up every week with the people that I get the information with. And the interesting thing is I put a compliance piece in here just to see for the telescopes, the study that will be coming out later this year, or actually next year on the rigid telescopes, just to see, because I asked the OR to wipe the scopes down and put the scopes back in the tray. And I wanted to see how they arrived in SPD. And because if you go back to those other studies we talked about, we had an on-site endoscopic specialist that was babysitting all those telescopes. And I always wondered, what if those people aren't there? Are we going to get the same results? So it was, I was thinking, some critical thinking, trying to think, okay, how is this going to be affected? And so I was glad I put the compliance piece in there, because we don't have someone doing that up there. It's just what every hospital deals with for the most part. This is how it happens. And so I can't wait for that article to come out. I'm in the process of writing that one right now, but it's really interesting that, if you work with people and you're kind and polite, they're really happy to help you. And so this has been working with Altru has been it's been wonderful. It really has been a great experience.
What a novel idea, right? Treat people with respect and you get them on your side and you'll accomplish something. It's so funny though, because, you would think that's so natural, but unfortunately it's not, right? The pointing fingers game happens everywhere, especially when money's involved. People get scared.
Yeah. And, and that once the revenue stream starts, whether it's an OEM, whether it's a third-party company doing the repairs, once that revenue stream starts, nobody likes to give it up. I mean, and what ends up happening is it turns into a line item pricing game. But the real problem never really gets addressed. And so, again, getting back to our first question, that's why I went into the business, because I wanted to get after helping hospitals. If I can save you 40, 60%, just by taking care of a few things, and let's start with the simple ones, like a basket tray for rigid telescopes or a custom tray for cataracts. Let's start there, and let's see if it makes sense and if it works. And if that works, then we can take that and we can visit that into every category of surgical instruments where you're having issues. Start with the easy one first. It may be the biggest dollar volume. It may not be. If you look at digital flexible ureteroscopes, they are out of sight to repair because you've got a chip in the tip. And at the previous OEM I was at, 1 month we got all of our flexible ureteroscopes were sent back in. And of the ones that came back in, 93% of them were flooded with fluid, whether it was urine or chemicals or whatever. And so you start asking, okay, well, does that mean that people aren't leak testing? Or does that mean that it's got a hole in it, and so they throw it into Steris to clean it before they ship it out to the company, and they flood the scope, and thus it creates a major repair. So there's lots of little issues. And with the manufacturers, they have to clean them when and the other repair companies, they clean them too. So there is a lot of work to be done there in that one area because it's so expensive. And that's with any flexible, whether it's colonoscopes, GI scopes, or any of those flexibles. There's just a tremendous gain to be had if we're allowed to go in and dive in and start pulling it apart and figuring out what's causing the problems.
So, Rick, for those who have not gotten a chance to read the Healthcare Purchasing News article about the study, how is that study ending up? What were the results of your time with those customized trays?
So in just the first 3 months, we had a 32% drop in what they were spending per month. And one of the interesting things that I interjected here in the conclusion was what I call the instrument failure rate. And that basically is you figure out how much all of your sets for this particular procedure are worth, and then you divide that out by what your monthly damage is. And that gives you a percentage. And that fell, their instrument failure rate by going to custom trays, it fell from 18% of their fleet was getting damaged monthly. And it fell to 3%. And that is phenomenal. I think you never want your repairs on stainless steel to be above 6% of your fleet. And they were tracking at about 18%, and now they're down to 3%. Actually, is a little less than that. As you know, the study has still got a few more months till it wraps up, but it's still basically hanging in the same area, and it may end up being a little bit less. But the interesting thing that I was talking to Justin about is that it's the same instruments in the trays that continue to break. So there's something needs to be looked at. Either they need to change manufacturers, or something is adversely affecting them, or it just may be, hey, they're really thin, and we only expect to get 50 uses out of them. It's just one of those critical questions that just needs to be you got to keep pulling that string till you get something that makes sense, and then you make a decision.
Yeah, follow the money. Right? That's really what it is. It's a money trail. It's where's the most expensive and what type, and then implement the process improvement to target that. We're going to be right back with Rick Wells talking about changing the culture of business as usual. Rick, we want to talk about another article that you had. This one in Vendor Vantage for the communique, and specifically I guess the title of it, we should say, Instrument Repairs, Why Business as Usual is Bad for Business, and the Bottom Line. And I think we already teed this up earlier in the interview just by saying you can't do things the same way, and even when we talked about, I think I said follow the money in the last segment, but really it's follow the data. And the more data you pull, the more you go down the rabbit hole, the more questions you have. It's the domino effect. There's more things that you want to find the answers to. But really, I'd say the resources are limited in many cases. Before we go into some of these studies, I want to just talk about some of the 6 concepts that you outline in the article. And one of them says identify benchmarks. It talks about compiling past data for the historical number of scopes being broken per month and setting some sort of a baseline metric. So here's my question. As we know that the resources may be limited for gathering that information, can you rely entirely on your vendor population to gather that and report on it? And especially if you have mix and match with vendors, how do you get that data all together? I know the quantity of repairs, that part might be easy, but if you start to ask those domino effect questions, it might be a little bit more difficult to make one-to-one comparisons with the data and get it all to line up.
The vendors that you use to fix your, and we're going to stick with telescopes because that's what's in that particular one, they'll know exactly how many are sent back to them every year. They know how many they make. They know what those averages are. In fact, you've heard of no fault. There's no fault clauses and all this capitation and all this kind of stuff. Well, the value analysts get to those numbers by using national averages. And, how often like orthopedic 4mm telescopes, they break at a rate. If you have 100 of those, 150 of them are going to break every single year. They break about 150% of your inventory. They'll either get shaved. So they know that's a national average. And so, and that's probably a bad example, but it's just an example that if you've got 100, 150 of them every year is going to break. So if you're tracking at 200 and you did your homework and you went back and you sent 200 out last year, you're 50 above the national average. So something's wrong. So that's when you begin to get very strategic and you start to follow the product through the hospital and find out how's it being handled. Is it the surgeon with the shaver? Is that what the problem is? And do we really drill down on it and we start to document what serial numbers go into what rooms with what doctors? Do we have people sign? It can depending on how bad the problem is, you can really get granular with it. So that's how you get that. Whoever's doing your repair business, you plug into them and you find out what their percentage of breakage is for that. You don't focus on all your telescopes. You pick 5mm, 0s and 30s and 45s, or you pick 10mm or 4mm or 2.9s or any, the smaller the diameter, the greater the percentage that break every single year. So if they're 1mm, they're going to get broken all the time because stuff gets laid down on top of them. So you have to figure out where your biggest number is and you attack that first. And that's why I choose telescopes, because these telescope trays really they do a fantastic job. And it's hardly noticeable, seamless.
I want to take a step back maybe and look at what tools have to be already in place for hospitals to get at some of these numbers. Like you mentioned in the article that you can enlist the original equipment manufacturer or independent service provider to help give you some of those averages. But you still need to build your own inventory based on the specific instrument type, the specific serial number, like you said. Is that possible without having some kind of instrument tracking system in place? Because we know kind of industry-wide, we're still hovering around 50%, maybe 55% of facilities now have any kind of instrument tracking. Everything else is done manually. Can you even start without that?
It's difficult. And so when I come into a hospital, I come in and I inventory everything. That way I know. Because of my experience from going out into hospitals, oftentimes people couldn't tell me how many 5mm telescopes they had. But as these instrument tracking services have come online, all of a sudden people say, yeah, I've got 16, I've got 95. We've had hospitals told us they had 500 rigid telescopes, and then when we looked at how many were bought from us, they'd bought 1,500 3 times, and they didn't know they had 3 times. They thought they only had 500, but they actually had 1,500 on site.
That's why they kept buying them. They were like, wait, we only have 500. We need more.
Yeah.
But no, really, you know what? You talk about taking an inventory. That's such a huge piece of not only instrument repair or instrument management, but just inventory management. I mean, if you don't know what your inventory is, it's really hard to plan when you know you're anticipating an increase in the number of procedures for a certain type of case. And so you inherently know, or, you think, well, we need to add more sets. But the truth is, you have to kind of look at when those cases are being scheduled, when the peak volume is. Do you really need to add a set or not? Or, maybe that only increases the need. But a lot of times, you're right, the instrument tracking systems have helped, but then there's duplicate trays. So you got to run utilization reports to make sure you know how many you actually have. And then there's always the case of the hidden instruments that find places in the hospital where they hide out and don't reemerge for 12 months. But I would say, you're absolutely correct. If you're going to come help a customer, that's the first step. Understand the inventory.
Absolutely. And you've got, to imagine you imagine FedEx not knowing how many trucks they have a year And, trucks, they break down. So that expense will bite you in the fanny when you've got FedEx trucks on the road, but you don't know how many you have, so that you can't plan for repair dollars and maintenance dollars over time. And that's what's happening to the hospitals. The telescope is hiding in the locker of the superhero that, shows up and brings it into the doctor, and ta-da! Well, guess what? The central sterile needs to know where that telescope is, and that there are actually 23 in the hospital and not 18. And again, that's one of the reasons I wrote the article, is from my experience of going through all the different hospitals for 6 years and things that I bumped into. And so that's where these concepts came from.
So, Rick, going into one of those other concepts that you mentioned, the root cause analysis, who do you see most likely to be able to do that, are most well positioned in the department to do that? Is that something that needs to happen in the room, in the OR room at the point of use? Should we be tasking specific technician to kind of take that mantle on themselves, or is this a leadership kind of decision-making process? What have you experienced out there?
Well, I think that right now it's not happening. And again, that's the reason. So what needs to happen is, I believe in empowering people. So you have champions that work in your department. You decide that you're going to be looking at product X. That person, the first thing that needs to happen is that person needs to become an expert on that product. And that doesn't mean necessarily how it's used in surgery, but hey, go read the IFUs. Read it, know it thoroughly, and then follow the instrument through the process. It's when you see what happens during the course of the what I call the cycle of use, it's alarming sometimes. And the things that you're told, well, this is what I was told. I'm not going to go into all those stories, but you just ask questions. Well, why do you guys do this? And it's the how and the why something gets broken. It's not who broke it or who did this. It's why do you think that occurs? Because there's so many things. There's either not having enough instruments, there's not having enough FTEs. All kinds of problems get dealt with sometimes in improper manners. But the first thing is knowing how many you have, and then you know what the IFUs state. And you can't always follow the IFUs, and if there's something that's a little jinky in there that doesn't make sense, call the person that made it and find out. Call their regulatory department and find out, and then collaborate with them, and you can come up with a great solution. So Hank, to answer your question is, pick somebody in your department that gets along well with the people in the operating room, because that's where you need to follow it up to the OR. Watch it as it's being used in surgery. And the excuse that you give is, hey, doc, surgeon, we're in this room because we want this to work every time it's in your hands. And when they hear you saying that, it's not this us against them. And so then they follow it down. It's eye-opening.
That quality guarantee, if you will, to the surgeons, or at least that commitment that we are going to, if there is an issue, we're going to follow up. And as you said, not find out the who, but the why, so that issue is not repeated again. Although many facilities won't be able to dedicate a full-time babysitter for all of their scopes, especially these facilities that have a larger repair bill for scopes, it should be a little easier to make those arguments to administration to say, hey, let's just see what happens to these numbers if we look at tray customization opportunities, and if we look at having that dedicated expert. And even now with Isham coming out with their CER certification, now you have a credential to put behind that specialist position to say, yes, not only are they tasked with these IFUs and this process, they have concrete credentials to back it up. They can be that face of quality to the physician. I think you can go a lot of places with that.
Mm-hmm. And that's part of, I don't want to be a leech in what I do. in that I put my fees down really low so that I can, for what they pay to fix a flexible or a rigid telescope, depending on what we're working on, what they pay for one for a month, I can come in and I'll teach your team how to do this and help them walk through, help you select different people. And in the protocols is really, concept 5. If you can recruit a surgeon of the specialty of the instruments you're trying to work on, and you get them on board because either you're doing custom trays or you're having them make sure that the instruments are arriving in the OR in optimum condition. And then once a month, the surgeon looks over the damage report and talks to the team of people. You need somebody from the OR, you need somebody from SPD, and you need a surgeon. And you walk through this, and I guarantee you that you'll see your repair dollars start to diminish. We had some problems in the current study on the telescope side at Altru, and I noticed that it was really high, and I called the team leaders, and I said, hey, at your Monday huddles, we had talked about doing this, and I noticed that, 85% of this isn't getting done. So can you just refresh everybody's memory? And they have Monday huddles every Monday, and instead of, waiting for the in-service to take place a month later, they do it every Monday. So that's a real nice little thing they do. And all of a sudden, the numbers fell again. They climbed really high in the first 2 weeks, and they fell. And I know that works because nobody wants to break stuff. You have, a bad apple every once in a while that might have an attitude issue or whatnot that, you run into that kind of thing. But for the most part, nobody wants to break anything. I know I sure don't. There's just a tremendous amount of money that's out there if we can take care of things in-house, and line item pricing. It's an important piece. You don't want to pay more than you should, but man, if we can take care of what's happening in-house first, you'll see declines of 40 to 60%, and then you deal with a line item.
I was just going to say, it's so funny that you say that, because the very thing that was on my mind before you went there was, a lot of consultative approaches are to go after that line item savings. But, your volumes could change, or all kinds of different variables go into that. But you're talking about reducing repair occurrences, and that's a deliverable that's measurable and has a direct impact on total spend.
So the one thing that I don't really mention in here that I have a wing of my company that we do is we basically have training sessions. We do 3 2-hour sessions or 6 2-hour sessions. And this is to basically understand why people do the things that they do. It just creates a sustainable environment that once you've implemented something, now you've trained these people and you're following up with them. And because behavior, a lot of times you don't really know why people do things. When you get into performance reviews and you sit down and you set up all these things and you have people that do well and some people don't do very well. And you have to scratch your head sometime and say, we've had this issue 3 years in a row. What's going on under the surface? So that's what the training looks at. That's another aspect because I want to create sustainable savings over time. And so that's one of the pieces that I didn't really address in here because at the time I didn't have somebody that I could rely on to do that, and I do now. So that's something that some hospitals actually have that piece already in-house where they can help people understand, what's going on. Am I making sense?
No, completely. I think it goes back to the other thing that really kicked off this segment, which was, how come there isn't somebody committed to collecting some of this data? Because the data, obviously, if you can collect it internally, can be more controlled and more directed at a specific initiative versus just looking at, to your point, if you're grabbing the data from the vendor, you're limited to what the vendor is going to collect. And I think that's kind of what you're getting at, is if the facility has somebody who's responsible for that who can help, then you can let that data lead you where you want to go and have the most impact for the institution.
And I know I cover half the United States. So as I started thinking about what I was going to do in this consulting, I just began to reflect on the numbers the sheer numbers of repair dollars that were coming out of some of these hospitals. And I thought, what if just 20% could be trimmed off just by changing behavior, maybe changing a protocol here or there? I mean, how much would that mean to them? And that's just in my area of expertise in minimally invasive surgery. And then you begin to take that and you visit that in all the other specialties and then into other departments of the hospital. I mean, $50 billion a year in repair in the United States. And that means it's probably that much in the world, another $50 billion elsewhere. So there's a lot of broken stuff going on. And I just think that there's a lot of room for improvement without too much difficulty. Now, you know, after a certain time, the low-hanging fruit goes away. Then it becomes difficult.
That's kind of where healthcare is at today. I mean, we'll have to table that conversation because I think that's a rocket ship to a whole nother episode. But I will say that's kind of where healthcare is at, is a lot of that low-hanging fruit has really been addressed in many cases. I mean, to your point, there's still some low-hanging fruit in certain categories of repair, and you go look for that, and like you said, it just kind of trails along, and then all of a sudden there's a spike. But I think the days of, you know, just the healthcare reform, all those initial hits have been taken care of, and now it requires innovative ways to reduce that budget without reducing quality. And so that's the pressure that's being put back on, you know, all of these hospitals. So I think some of the things that you shared with us today, Rick, are, you know, very helpful. And I can't tell you enough how much Hank and I will continue to push analytics and ways to, you know, gather data or studies to justify expenses, because under this crunch, expenses aren't being approved as easily. And so I think studies like the ones that you've done will definitely help people take a different viewpoint of, okay, so if we spend X, we can save some of that 20% that you just described out of the $50 billion that's being spent annually.
And again, some of it will never go away, but to just accept it as this is how much it's going to cost. I had one OR nurse told me, you know, when I told her what I was doing, she looked at me, she said, good luck with that. I'm like, you know what? That's why you're where you are, because something needs to be done. You know, healthcare is really interesting, Justin, in that it's the only thing that I buy that I don't know how much it costs before I buy it.
Yeah. Well, because you don't pay for all of it, but you're never quite sure how much of it you're going to pay for either. You're 100% right about that. I used to say, also, you know, when it comes to your health, you would go to the primary care doc, and it was the only time you were the customer where the customer was wrong, right? Because if you go in and you're a smoker, or you're drinking, or you're doing anything, you're not eating healthy, this is the first time you've ever gone to somebody and paid them money and found out, you know, you're the one that's wrong, and that requires a paradigm shift as well. But we are out of time. We have to wrap the interview, but I will say, Rick, it was a pleasure having you on. I think Hank and I got some good notes, and I think our listeners will appreciate your insights as well. That was Rick Wells, president at SolutionWells LLC, a consulting company that engages with hospitals and businesses to identify and reduce unnecessary costs. And specifically, we talked a lot, Hank, about rigid endoscopes, and that's definitely, I think we said it on the last show, or 2 shows ago maybe, that they're not rigid, they're not rugged, they're fragile endoscopes. And I thought it was really interesting, the one scenario that he described where somebody essentially hand transported and cared for the minimally invasive surgical instruments. I don't think it was just rigid telescopes. I think there were lap instruments that were included that as well. But essentially that there were no damaged rigid scopes during that period of time. That's pretty impressive when you look at the amount of money that an average hospital would spend on the repairs of a rigid scope. I mean, that almost could create an FTE if you could replicate it.
What's interesting about that, Justin, is as he was talking about this dedicated person, in the background, obviously, the theme of the episode being customized trays. As a leader, I'm thinking, well, if you can't hire a person full-time to babysit your scopes and instruments, then get that customized tray to do the babysitting for you. Obviously, there's some care and handling, still involved there, but if you use that technology appropriately, then you can get the same outcome. Your repairs go down, your processes are more streamlined. One big thing that stuck out to me early on from the interview was these custom trays make it easy for the OR staff to put the items back in the place where they go. And that kind of process-driven philosophy that doesn't go to taping or to color coding necessarily, but goes to this little widget here is made to fit in the square, and it's the best of all possible worlds.
Yeah, absolutely, because the other theme was transportation. And so if the trays make it easy for the nurses and surgical techs to put them securely in the container, then during transport, they're much less likely to get damaged. And he used the example of transporting ophthalmic trays to an eye center that was off-site that was going to be transported in a vehicle. And so I kind of thought to myself, I said, that's right. The instruments need to buckle up before they go for a ride. Otherwise, if they wind up getting into even a fender bender, they could get hurt. And, it was just kind of funny. It just occurred to me in the moment. And especially as you do see, even clinic trays, and I know a lot of the clinic trays aren't always surgical grade instruments, but they wind up reprocessing them. But you'd like to see them be surgical grade. But there are, in many instances, these instrument sets are going for a ride and they're not buckled up and they're not secured. So no wonder they get damaged.
There's a similar process challenge when you talk about wrapped trays, and we're always trying to look at it. I think the phrase that Rick used was eliminating non-critical touches. And so we look at processes for that for tar wrapped items, so there's no rips or tears, tar contamination going on there, but bringing that philosophy in to the instrumentation themselves and saying, how can we seat this and buckle this up in a way, like you said, that could withstand a short drop, a bounce over a threshold inside of a case cart. Those kind of things can be the root cause for some serious damage if you don't have those instruments buckled up. Great topic tonight. I had a great time with him.
Yep, absolutely. That's going to do it for this week's show. As a reminder, you can help support us by subscribing to Beyond Clean on iTunes and Stitcher. We'd certainly appreciate a rating and a review because your feedback is important to the show. And on behalf of Hank and myself, thank you for listening to another edition of Beyond Clean.